From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today's guest is Congressman Bill Posey, a freshman member of the House of Representatives. He represents the 15th District in Florida, an area known as Space Coast due to its proximity to Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center. Bill's a longtime public servant who's served as a city councilman, a state representative, a state senator. He's joined us today to share his insights on several issues such as government accountability, energy independence. Congressman, great to have you here.
Great to be with you always, Tom.
Well, I tell you what, you've off to a fast start here, and you got here at a pretty interesting time. But before we get into that, I usually like to let the viewers and listeners know a little bit about you. And one of the things that caught my eye is when you were in the Florida legislature, you were known as Mr. Accountability. I mean, I can't think of any quality that is more absent from Washington, D.C. than accountability. How'd you get a nickname like that?
Well, one of my goals when I was elected to the State House initially was to try and make government account for what actually gets accomplished, not just how much gets spent. And that's novel in government. It took 8 years to pass that legislation in the Florida House. It made me a National Legislator of the Year by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the nation's oldest and largest bipartisan nonprofit membership association of lawmakers. And I've tried since then to get that passed in other states, but no other state seems to have the political will to take a bold step like actually trying to be more accountable.
What were the conditions that let you get that done in Florida?
Persistence, absolute persistence. I beat my head on the wall for 8 years and actually wrote a book about it to explain it. I got so tired of explaining it to people and it going nowhere, I finally wrote a book so that anybody could read it and understand it. It's online at my campaign website, which is billposey.com, and I'd be glad to send anybody a complimentary copy. I've sent them to every state legislative appropriations chairman in the nation, every majority leader, every minority leader. Everybody says, man, this is a great idea, and nobody ever does it because it takes persistence. The bureaucrats hate it. The bureaucrats absolutely, they almost got Jeb Bush to veto it after all that work. They got Jeb and they said, oh, this is going to cost us too much money. And I said, what do you mean? They ought to know this off the top of their head.
And ought to save you money, frankly, every year.
So Jeb finally got enthusiastic about it and signed it, and it became law, much to the chagrin of the bureaucrats. But like I said, they have stonewalled it in 49 other states.
Well, you got here at a very interesting time. Florida's loss, obviously, our gain. But going to the Financial Services Committee, which, again, most of our viewers and listeners don't follow this, but that's really one of the premier committees in Congress. And to get there as a freshman really suggests how highly that your colleagues think of you, and certainly our leadership thinks of you to put you there. And at this particular time, when we've just gone through and are still dealing with the consequences of a tremendous financial crisis that overtook the country last fall, you're really dealing with some of the really big issues that the Congress is confronting. So I want to get your thoughts first. The two big items that I always associate these days with financial services are, number one, consumer protection. There's supposedly legislation moving through the committees in the Congress that'll take care and make consumers somewhat more protected. And second, eventually, what do you think needs to be done in terms of making sure we don't have another situation like we had in September of 2008, that we have transparency or whatever regulatory framework would be appropriate to protect us from the kind of financial meltdown we experienced last fall?
Well, the majority's answer to that problem, to both those problems, is more government regulation, less personal freedom, less personal choice, and that's wrong. If that would have solved the problem, we wouldn't be here today, because they brought more regulation, more government, less personal freedom after the S&L crisis of the 80s. And here we are right back to where we were in the 80s, except twice as bad, because it affected the residential market first, and now it's spilling over into the commercial market. We know, quite frankly, that we haven't been doing the job we were supposed to do. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, they've got 4,000 lawyers, no, 2,000 lawyers, 1,100 lawyers, 4,000 employees. The lawyers file an average of one half case every other year. They file 600 cases a year.
Statistic.
You do the math. Each lawyer is required to, or is filing one case. Now, a case can be whether you're a violator, somebody like Madoff, or just that you forgot to dot an I across a T on your application for a securities license. That's pretty sad. I mean, if you knew that each trooper in the state of Oklahoma only wrote a half a ticket every other year, nobody would respect the speed limit out there, I'll tell you. So that's what we have. And we have a case where 10 years ago, this guy named Markopoulos, he used to be an investigator for the Securities Exchange Commission. He took a file. When he stopped being an investigator, he said, I'm going to go where the real money's made. I'm going to start selling this stuff. So he picked a guy that was doing real well to study, and it was Madoff, who's making money hand over fist for investors, and he's going to try and emulate what he did. Well, he gets copies of his trading slips, and he said, wait a minute, this guy's losing money. He can't be paying these great dividends. This is a hoax. So he takes this file, prepared from an investigator's perspective, because he's a former investigator, and takes it to the SEC and says, look, this guy's a Ponzi scheme artist. You got to get him off the market before he hurts people. And they go, okay, thanks. And a year goes by, they did nothing. He goes back again. He said, look, here's another file. You got to stop this guy. He's going to harm people. They go, hey, would you butt out? We know what we're doing. We don't need your help. So he goes to Barron's Magazine. They do a big cover story, profile what a Ponzi scheme this is. And that's why none of the big hedge fund managers or money managers got hooked by Madoff. But still, he was allowed to plunder over $70 billion from unknowing private investors and little guys on the street, quite frankly, because the SEC did not do its job. And Tom, to this day, they've had internal investigation after internal investigation. I don't think anyone in the SEC has even been reprimanded yet. Now, there's not a business in Oklahoma that would let an employee get away with that. I'd even venture to say the state of Oklahoma's government wouldn't stand still for something like that. But up here, so. And the question that begs for an answer is, how many more worthless agencies or how many more people are we going to get in place that aren't going to do their job? Why don't we focus on some accountability? Let's see who's responsible for this. And let's terminate them. I mean, that's what a business would do. That's what the state of Oklahoma would do. If you had an agency head in Oklahoma that let somebody get plundered for $70 billion, their head would be on a platter. The number 2, 3, and 4 person probably, maybe the whole department, you'd be looking to restaff the agency. But up here, no. And, you asked, how I find this place. I mean, I find it, quite frankly, very dysfunctional. And I'm saddened that the party in majority right now has hijacked the two-party system. I mean, we've had a two-party system since, the founding fathers were here. We know we have to have it. But, the very privilege that the Republicans gave the Democrats to timely remit, when they were in charge, out of respect to the minority, to keep this two-party system functioning, the very first vote I was a part of when I got here was Pelosi taking that away from the minority. I mean, so we look at this health care bill now, written completely in secret. We have a Department of the Treasury wouldn't tell us who got stimulus money and TARP money. One of my first committee meetings, the acting Secretary of the Treasury said, we want to know who all got this money. And he said, well, we're not going to tell you. And so both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans said, no, this is Congress, you have to tell us. We go, no, we don't. You can't make us. End of subject, next question. I mean, it's that kind of disrespect for the process, is that kind of lack of accountability is a big reason we're having all the problems that we're having now.
What are the types of things in that regard, accountability and oversight, that you think perhaps the Florida legislature did well and that we're not doing up here?
Well, the biggest things, when I got elected to the Florida legislature in '92, we were a minority just like this. This feels like déjà vu to me. I mean, the party in power was doing horrible things, and I thought, the media can cover for them all they want to, but sooner or later, the people back home are going to figure out what's being done to them, and they're not going to like it. And by golly, we got rocketed into a position of power at a majority as soon as the public really found out what was going on. We happen to have the most principled human being I've ever met, Dan Webster, from Winter Garden. He was our first speaker since Reconstruction, and because he was such a principled human being, I think approval rating for the Florida legislature is around 60 now. For Congress, on a good day, it's 11 or 12, and it's because of the leadership that we had that was principled. There have been leaders of the House and Senate, since them, in some cases, have diminished the good strides that we made, and that's going to happen over time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, eternal vigilance is important in any level of government. It's important for the constituency too. But still, principled leadership was in large part responsible for the tradition that's still being carried on. We don't move the previous question down there like they do up here. You know, we allow debate from both sides. We show a little bit more respect for the minority now, and the Republicans showed more respect for the minority clearly than Pelosi is showing for the minority now. Like I said, I have witnessed basically the two-party system being hijacked. I feel like I'm in Rome when somebody lit the match to burn the place.
Well, hopefully we won't get that far. But your point's a very, very well taken point. I've been around politics in the minority and the majority here, in the minority in the state legislature. And the minority can be your best friends if you let them do their job, because frankly they save you an enormous amount of embarrassment. They're looking to find things, they're trying to make a point, they're actually doing hard work, and if you let them do it, they'll help you effectively clean up a mess before it blows up on your watch. I actually would argue that we did not do enough of that ourselves, not just where the Democrats were concerned, but we were not nearly as aggressive during the Bush presidency on oversight as we probably should have been in retrospect. So it's an institutional failing up here, without a doubt.
I get along pretty good with most of my delegation colleagues from across the aisle here in Florida just because of that. I mean, I was chairman of a committee that had 5 members. All the other committees down there had like 20-some members when I was in the House. I heard every bill referred to it, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, a senior member or a freshman. I also killed the most bills, by the way. I mean, we heard them. If they were good ideas, we advanced them. If they didn't, we killed them. You know, we tried to help people make their bills better, but if it was a bad idea, then it was a bad idea. But they got their day in court. They had a hearing. They didn't do like they do in the floor to us all the time, move the previous question, wipe out your amendments. They're not worth hearing. We refuse to even hear them. I tried to make the minority party a part of the solution, not part of the problem. I mean, I passed, we had the highest, when I was in the Senate, as chairman of the Banking and Insurance Committee, we had the highest worker compensation in the nation. Businesses collapsing, going upside down because I did some important reforms. I wrote a 23-page paper on the 9 kinds of fraud, got the Democrats involved in passing, ended up passing the legislation unanimously to reform legislation, workers' compensation, if you can imagine that.
That's
trial lawyers in,
yeah.
doctors in, I mean, everybody in. We got a notice they reduced rates for the 7th time the other day since 2003. We're not even in the top 10. They're like 63% lower now than they were in 2003. With the cost of everything else in the nation going up, because we put in good policy, those rates are going down. Reform homeowners insurance, changed 80 substantive Florida statutes to be more consumer friendly because those rates were going out of the roof. So it's affordable now. Election reform. I got elected to the state senate in 2000 after the 2000 election fiasco. You can imagine the animosity in it. I ended up passing legislation that passed unanimously to bring the statutes in Florida up to date. Most states copy exactly what I did with the provisional ballot, the precinct-based optical scanners, which were, a benefit to the Democrats.
I like to brag that we put those in 1989.
Yeah.
Actually carried the legislation.
Yeah.
89 and 90 in Oklahoma.
And it's fair. And passed that, ended up passing that unanimously. And except for areas in Florida where they can't get the lazy people to go to work on poll day, there's no election problems. There's no need for recounts. Some people still feel the need to file suits after every election, but they don't go anywhere because it's a bulletproof system.
No, they're great, and you got that paper back up with an optical scanner. It really makes it easy. Let me ask you this, because again, you're a very practiced state legislator as well as now a federal one. My experience with most state legislatures is that there's real legislation on the floor. And that is, you're really legislating. There's real things. Up here, a lot of folks tune in and watch C-SPAN. They'll notice most of the time, no matter how passionate and even how intelligent the argument, excuse me, there won't be members there. And the real legislative activity has occurred in committee. Woodrow Wilson used to like to say, and he was, of course, a tremendous scholar of Congress, that Congress on the floor is Congress's theater, Congress in committee is Congress at work. That's a problem, I think, for us, because we miss half the legislative process and things that would involve the whole membership. People will be able to bring in, a point of view. But again, our rules, our limitation on amendments, and the fact that we've got committees constantly running on the time we're on the floor make that very difficult. You have the same kinds of frustration, and number one, and then number two, how, as an entity, is your committee working in terms of allowing open debate, examination, what have you?
Well, a number of parts of that question. The chairman of the committee, Barney Frank, is surprisingly open to hearing amendments. We haven't moved any previous questions yet. Part of the big dysfunction I found in this place is the complete lack of structure. On almost every state legislature, Oklahoma, I'm sure it's Florida, you would have Appropriations Committee would meet on Monday,
exactly right.
Criminal Justice Environment on Tuesday, Education, something else on Thursday, and so you could kind of structure your day around what committees you were on. Here, any committee chairman calls a meeting at his whim. Financial Services meets just about every day. There's a lot of work to do there, and I understand that, and I'm not complaining about it, but it's just you don't have a week-out schedule. I'm not on any other committees other than Financial Services, and it's 2 subcommittees, but like you're on multiple committees. You could have 3 chairmen call a meeting at the exact same time, but Tom Cole can only be one place at one time. So you can have a problem. You can miss votes in 2 committees, and people say, hey, what are you missing the votes for? It's because you're human and you can only be one place at one time. That's very dysfunctional. The legislation, almost every state legislature, you can read legislation, I mean, just really at a click, because the change language, if they delete language, they strike it out. When they insert new language, they underline it. And when you read legislation, 90% of it is existing language, so you don't bother wasting time on the existing stuff. You go right to the underline and right to the stricken. They don't do that up here. They just give you a dictionary, and you try and figure out what's new and what's old. And it takes a lot of time to do that. And unfortunately, the fact about committee being the place the work is done is almost passé from my observation, because so much of what was done, for example, in his health care bill was done behind closed doors, and it was brought out and just rolled over the minority members on the committee. Nobody in the minority knew what was in that thing till a copy was printed yesterday, I think. And so that was the first blush that any of them had at it. And so, we need a 72-hour rule up here where all legislation is available for at least 72 hours. We need a single subject rule where you cannot deal with more than one subject in legislation. Yep. And if you don't have the willpower, the political will to have a single subject rule, at least vote on separate subjects in legislation separately. I mean, I know you were as frustrated as I was when they come with a military funding bill and they stick hate crimes on the back of it, which has absolutely nothing to do with military funding. They've already passed that phony hate crime legislation. It was just an in-your-face to try and make principled people who would vote against that look bad, so that at election time they could say, oh, you voted against the troops, you voted against funding the troops. I mean, that was preposterous. I mean, that, it ought to be illegal. It's certainly not a moral thing to do.
Well, we did exactly the same thing in the Afghan troop funding bill with money for the International Monetary Fund. 2 totally unrelated subjects, and one where, frankly, most of the Republicans supported the president's initial request. He got 160 some odd of our 170 some odd votes. Then when they put in IMF funding, he lost almost all the Republican votes. Partly because there was a lot of controversy about that particular issue, partly just as a matter of principle, that we don't legislate, particularly on national security issues this way, that it's bad enough that we do this domestically, but we're talking about American troops in combat. Our total focus in defense legislation and military funding legislation ought to be their well-being and what it takes to get the job done. It's the point you made. You're bringing back all the frustrations of my freshman year. I'm now on appropriations, so I'm on a single committee like you with subcommittees, and we don't overlap. But that first 2 years, I was on Armed Services, I was on Ed and Labor, and I was on Natural Resources, and it was literally impossible to get to all of them. And so, I always made Armed Services my priority simply because I think that's the preeminent issue. But wow, was it frustrating. And each committee, very different in temperament. Armed Services really, I must say, is a much more bipartisan committee than any of the others I've served on. Until actually Approach is fairly bipartisan. But the others were extremely partisan, and it was about trapping people or getting this done or ramming this through, as opposed to let's sit down and look at what we need to get done. So it's a frustration. Let me ask you this, because we could talk inside baseball forever, but Tell me what your view is, given your background, given the committee you sat on now, about the type of things we need to do and avoid doing in terms of financial markets going forward. You know, we clearly had a near-death experience in the financial sector in the fall. It'll always be controversial as to how it was handled, but I don't think there should be too much debate that we need some sort of either different approach or different attitude, and you're right in the middle of helping figure out what that is.
Well, first thing is you don't choke the financial market to death with regulations. What's going to happen when you say, okay, we're going to regulate derivatives like thus, which across the board it's almost impossible to do, Tom. I mean, cruise lines do intercompany derivatives with other cruise lines to hedge against the price of fuel in the high seas. I mean, it's you know, so you take a definition like that and you say, oh, we're only looking at the dangerous derivatives on Wall Street, you know, or that AIG might have. Well, the reality is that when you put that definition in there, you're talking a broad spectrum. So when you start over-regulating something like this, and that's the direction we're going, all you do is drive those investments offshore, where they're totally unregulated, where there is no accountability or liability for wrongdoing, where we cannot begin to recover Americans' money if people abscond with it, but where profit is always going to go. I mean, you know, investors are always going to go where they have a chance to operate best, the good and the bad. 90% of the people aren't abusing the law, and they're not overly risky. There's 10% that are, because they never get sent to jail. I went to a press conference that Congressman Shadag had today about the ERISA laws. I mean, we had a case in Florida where I knew somebody, a clerk that I bumped into him, and this person that was 6'4", 230 pounds, looked emaciated, looked about 110 pounds, found out he had cancer, found out he had gone through the chemo, was ready for a bone marrow transplant so it would never return, but he got kicked out of the hospital because his company wasn't paying the claims. I went to the state of Florida and said, well, we can't do anything about that. It's under ERISA. We've got over a dozen companies in Florida writing insurance, taking premiums, but they're not paying claims, and we can't do it because it's under ERISA. Okay, so I did a budget amendment to get rid of their jobs and replace them with somebody who would do something about it. And they got on the ball, and they, for the first time, they crossed state lines. 11 state agencies were involved in busting these principals of this company. They got sent to prison, but it was the first time state lines were ever crossed to enforce health care law. When they cuffed the first guy, his wife is screaming, you promised me they'd never come after you for this. I mean, they wrote business in 49 states, every state but their own state of Indiana, because no governments had ever crossed those state lines. The bureaucrats were lazy. They didn't want to go to the trouble to prosecute it. Now, they got sent to prison. Now, you know how many of those people we have doing business in Florida today? Zero, not a zilch. They may all be doing business in your state, but we put them in prison, and they're not doing business in our state. We need to do the same thing with the financial market. I want to see some heads roll. I want to know, you know, why the FBI, you know, the entire Justice Department, why the Federal Trade Commission, not just the SEC, you know, why all these agencies became so lax in enforcement of the laws that we have. Now they're all opening up big new agencies within their agencies, but the cat's out of the bag. We need to go back and we need to have some prosecutions. I mean, we look at the inventor of cap and trade, the national energy tax. Who was that? A guy named Ken Lay with Enron. You know, well, what happened to Ken Lay? Well, he died, but I mean, before that, you know, he's going to go to prison for a long, long time. There's a lot of Ken Lays in this financial market that causes to. I don't see them lined up outside the courtroom door ready to be tried and convicted. You
know, I think you make a very important point. I remember listening to one of the first publicized health care town hall meetings by Senator Arlen Specter. Now, Senator Specter and I don't agree very much, and he had a pretty tough town hall, but he said something there that actually got a lot of cheers and made a lot of sense. And we were talking about Medicare fraud and abuse. And he said that is a huge problem, and let me address this as an old prosecutor. He'd been a district attorney in Philadelphia, and said, I don't see enough guys going to jail. You know, if you start putting people in jail that are stealing money, not just fine them, not just slap them on the wrist, that's cost of doing business to them. Jail time is real time. You know, and that place just, of course, broke into applause. And I think that's true. I think agency after agency, this idea of accountability that we will do something is pretty important. You mentioned cap and trade. You've got to cast a pretty important vote on that. Give us a couple minutes or whatever on what you think about cap and trade.
Well, I think it's a pretty sorry concept. I mean, we know who invented it. Ken Lay invented it as a way to get more money without doing anything. We know there was $638 billion in Obama's budget, revenue from cap and trade. The public is surprised usually to find out how that money got in the budget, how it would get into the coffers. They would take what today is a blank sheet of paper, and suddenly it becomes a carbon tax, and they have an auction till they sell $638 billion worth of these things. And of course, the speculators, which we expect to be the petroleum companies, will not sell them for what they paid. They'll want to get double their money at least, so that'd be over $1 trillion. So when your local power company of your people back home exceeds their carbon footprint they had in 2005, and if they're still in business, they're going to exceed it, they're going to have to pay whatever the market demands to get this little certificate. So if they got to pay $5 billion or $5 million for that, the price is going to get passed on to the customers, and they don't see it. And you know, the media says, you know, they asked me to do a guest editorial on it one time, and I said what it would cost the average consumer. And they said, we're not going to print that. That's a lie. That's not true. We're not going to print it. I said, well, you do the math. Over $1 trillion divided by 117 million families, you do the math. Boom, slam the phone up. I didn't get anything printed, you know. But the reality is it would be, you know, tragic. It's like the healthcare is going to cost us 5.5 million jobs. Cap and trade is going to cost us more than that. You know, what this country needs right now is jobs. They don't need more regulation. They don't need more taxes. We need jobs. And it seems like Pelosi is just hell-bent on doing everything she possibly can to kill more jobs. And I don't understand it yet. I mean, maybe when I'm here long enough, Tom, I'll begin to understand how that works.
The cap and trade thing is theology. It's not rational. It is unbelievable the commitment people have to a bad system. And a system, I couldn't agree more, it would bankrupt the country, hurt the average consumer, drive up energy costs, cost you thousands of jobs, and the only people who get rich are the same people who got rich the last big meltdown we had.
Yeah, I mean, what did it do in Europe? Nothing.
Absolutely.
It made no difference on the environment. They just lost how many millions of jobs, actually.
Well, you're a great guest because we're about out of time, and you've made this fun and gone quick. If you ever want to run for office, you get tired of living in Florida, come to Oklahoma. We need more guys like you. But I want to thank you, Bill. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Cole on Congress. Until next time, this is Congressman Tom Cole from our nation's capital, and you've just heard one of the reasons why I'm very optimistic about the future. We've got guys like Bill Posey in the Congress of the United States. So thanks for joining us today.